Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Allett, and I'm a professor of American history at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. This is my fourth appearance with One Day University. I previously spoke about Lewis and Clark, about American water politics, and about the history of the Grand Canyon. But today I'm going back to Britain, my country of origin, to talk about Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, who was nicknamed the Iron Lady. The nickname was meant as an insult. It was given by a Russian politician. But she picked it up and turned it into a compliment and often referred to herself as the Iron Lady from that time on. Now, the political issues of Margaret Thatcher's day all focus around what happened to Britain between World War II and 1979 when she came into office. During World War II, Britain had a coalition government made up of members of the three major parties, Conservative, Labour and Liberal. But as soon as the war in Europe ended, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, called an election. He expected that he would win because of the gratitude of the British people for his successful wartime leadership. But what actually happened is that the man who'd been his wartime Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who's shown here in the picture, who'd been the Deputy Prime Minister during the war years and was the leader of the Labour Party, won an overwhelming victory. It was the first time since its creation in 1900 that Labour had won an overall majority of seats in Parliament. Now, Labour was a socialist party, and it was dedicated to abolishing capitalism, but to doing it peacefully rather than using the revolutionary techniques of the Soviet Union. And so in the years between 1945 and 1950, as Britain began to recover from the devastation of World War II, the Labour government went ahead and nationalised nearly all of Britain's major industries. One of the most dramatic events was the creation of the National Health Service. This is a photograph taken on the first day that the National Health Service went into effect in 1948. And the man in the picture is Aneurin Bevan. He was the Minister for Health. He'd started life as a Welsh coal miner. So it's obviously a staged picture in which the girl in bed is not too sick to talk to the minister, and the nursing sister and the matron are looking on benevolently. Well, from that moment right up to the present, the National Health Service has been an absolutely central institution in British life. And even though Margaret Thatcher was very much against nationalisation, she never attempted to undo the National Health Service. In 1951, the Conservative Party came back into power and remained in power between then and 1964, under the leadership of four different Conservative prime ministers: Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and Alec Douglas Hume. But what's so striking about all four of them, from our point of view, is that they maintained Attlee's policy of nationalisation. There were a few elements of the economy were denationalised, like trucking, but the main industries remained nationalised concerns: coal mining, iron and steel, shipbuilding, the dockyards, the railways, national health, the universities, and many more. And this was partly because they all dreaded the conditions which had prevailed in Britain before World War II, which was a condition of the Great Depression and very high unemployment. High unemployment had come to seem like an intolerable burden, and members of both major parties were determined to prevent it from happening again if they possibly could. Now, it was against this that Margaret Thatcher was absolutely determined to change Britain's course. She rejected nationalisation, and she did everything she could to re-privatise the British economy with a fairly high degree of success. And perhaps most significant of all, she broke the power of Britain's overmighty trade unions, which had had a disproportionate say in the politics of the years since 1945. In addition to that, she won a war against Argentina, which made her enormously popular. And she halted Britain's relative decline. From 1945 onward, Britain was becoming steadily less important as a world power and as an economic power. And the decline came to seem almost inevitable until her administration. And from then on, Britain's prominent role in the world has to a large degree recovered. And so her administration between 1979 and 1990 marks an absolute transition point in the fortunes of Britain as a nation in the world. She was born in Grantham, which is a small, unremarkable town in the English East Midlands, one of hundreds of little towns, really rather unremarkable. Her father, Alfred Roberts, owned a corner shop which doubled as a post office. And so here it is shown in the picture on the left, and there is Alfred Roberts, her father. Now, later on in life, she always credited her views and her values and her ideals to the tutelage of her father, and she idolized him. He was a Methodist lay minister. The whole family went to the Methodist meeting house twice each week, each Sunday. And he was a good preacher. He was also a city alderman and finally rose to the position of mayor of the city of Grantham. But to have come from such origins was very unusual for anybody who rose to the leadership of the Conservative Party. The great majority of Conservative Party leaders have been right from the very top echelons of British society. Aristocrats, people like Winston Churchill, who was born at Blenheim Palace, and her relatively lowly social origins caused a lot of sneering among the snobbish part of the Conservative Party. But she was a woman of enormous ambition and enormous determination, who was willing to be unpopular, who was willing to be sneered at, and who was determined not to be turned from her path by snobbery or social criticism within her own party as well as from the other side. The photograph on the right shows her with her older sister Muriel when she was about 3. And the picture on the left shows her when she was about 18, about to go off to college at Oxford University. She had a distinguished academic record in school and went to Oxford, one of Britain's 2 premier universities. Until the late 19th century, Oxford and Cambridge were boys only, but a few women's colleges were created at the very end of the 19th century. And Margaret Thatcher went to one of them, Somerville College, Oxford, which is shown here in the picture, when she was an undergraduate. She was a college freshman in 1943, which means that she went to Oxford in the middle of the Second World War. She'd been born back in 1925. And so Oxford was very unusual when she was there. Normally, it's absolutely chock full of men, but of course, most of the men of college age were then fighting in the military services against Germany and Japan. So the demographic makeup of Oxford was different from usual. She rose to the position of leadership of the Oxford University Conservative Association, which perhaps might have been a bit more difficult during one of the peacetime years when dominant and ambitious men would have been the overwhelming presence. One of the books she read while she was at Oxford was The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was an Austrian economist who'd fled from the Nazis in the late 1930s. And this book he wrote, published in 1944, when she was in her second year as an undergraduate, was a warning against letting central governments become too powerful, especially in economic matters. Hayek said, human freedom, the most important human freedoms are economic freedoms. We must not let governments take them away because that's the road to autocracy, which snuffs out ordinary citizens' liberties. Margaret Thatcher read this book and took it to heart, and very often in later life, she would quote it as one of the most important formative influences on her political thinking. But unlike many people who end up as conservatives, she never had a period of youthful radicalism in which she flirted with the politics of the political left. From beginning to end, she was absolutely flinty in her single-minded dedication to conservative principles. Now, one of the many things which made her very unusual was that as an undergraduate, she was a chemistry major. She was a scientist. Overwhelmingly, British members of Parliament have got degrees in either law or politics or history or philosophy. And famously, British members of Parliament don't really know much about the sciences, which have consistently been underrepresented in important places in British life. But she was a scientist, and after she graduated from Oxford, her first couple of jobs were in chemical companies working as a research chemist. So this was in the late 1940s. But in about 1950, she met Dennis Thatcher, and soon married him. And here's the marvelous picture of their wedding, in which her hat is absolutely incomparable. Dennis Thatcher, who was to be a stalwart supporter from then on for the rest of their lives together, had been married before, but unsuccessfully. His first wife had been unfaithful to him while he was away fighting in Italy during World War II. And so he'd become divorced. But what he and Margaret Thatcher had in common was a deep, deep dedication to conservative politics. He was already well-to-do. He ran a family business. And with the money he brought to the marriage, she was able to leave her work as a research chemist and put herself through law school and become an English lawyer, which was a more likely path to an eventual political career. And she was a candidate for a seat in Parliament frequently in the 1950s. She ran for Parliament for the first time in 1950 when she was only 24 or 5. And then again in 51 and 54. On all three occasions, she was unsuccessful, but that didn't discredit her because she ran for a seat, or stood as it's called in Britain. She stood for a seat at a place called Dartford in southeast London, which was a constituency of working class people with a heavy, heavy Labour majority. And she was able to reduce the Labour Party's majority in Dartford, which meant that the leaders of the Conservative Party noticed her and said, when the opportunity arises, we'll find for her a safe Conservative seat in which she's much more likely to be elected. She distinguished herself from undergraduate days onwards as a tireless campaigner for the Conservative Party. She was willing to get out onto the streets, to knock on doors, to go to meetings in people's houses or in little church halls, and to make speeches for the party. And its leaders were impressed by her knowledge of the issues. She was always a workaholic, always seemed to be able to manage on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, and therefore built up a good reputation as a hard party worker. She did take a break from politics in the mid-1950s because in 1953 she gave birth to twins, Mark and Carol Thatcher. They were born just 3 years before I was. And so when I look at this picture of Mark Thatcher, especially on the right, this little boy in about 1956 or 7, it's just like the photos of me when I was 3 or 4 or 5 years old in the late 50s and early 1960s. So briefly, she was a professional housewife and mother, but she'd got far too much ambition and energy to stay at home. And in 1959, for the first time, she won a seat in Parliament. This was in the constituency of Finchley, which is one of the North London suburbs, much more prosperous than Dartford, which had steady Conservative majorities year after year. She won this seat in 1959 and held it continuously from then on, right through until she retired from the House of Commons in 1992. And she was known as a conscientious constituency politician, going regularly to her constituency nearly every weekend, meeting constituents, listening to their concerns, and trying to make sure that the problems they were aware of were dealt with. Of course, if you're a London MP, it's relatively easier because it's just a short tube or cab ride from the Houses of Commons to your constituency. If you're a member from the north of England or Scotland, it's more challenging. You have to do a lot more travelling. Straight away, she made a name for herself in the House of Commons and was taken on as a junior minister in the Department of Pensions in the early 1960s. To be a minister of any kind in a British government, you've got to be a member of Parliament as well. And the Prime Minister is merely the leader of the party which has the most seats in the House of Commons. So unlike in America, where the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Treasury are not members of Congress, in Britain, you have to be a member of Parliament in order to head one of the ministries. She was very disappointed in 1964 when the Labour Party won another majority under the leadership of Harold Wilson. He was an Oxford professor of politics and economics, but believed very strongly in the principles of socialist Labour, and he'd been a junior member of Parliament under Clement Attlee and intended to carry out these policies. He was already worried by the fact that the Labour Party, that the trade unions, which had brought the Labour Party into existence, were so powerful. And he was also worried by the fact that Britain's industries, particularly the nationalized ones, found it very hard to be competitive on the world market. In 1970, Edward Heath won another election victory for the Conservative Party, and that brought Margaret Thatcher back into the party with a parliamentary majority. So for the next four and a half years, she was part of the governing party. And it was in the Heath government that for the first time she got a full ministerial position. She became the Minister for Education and Science. By 1970, her twins were 17. And so during the 60s, she'd had growing children. She'd been the shadow minister for education during the 60s and was therefore well equipped to become involved in these kinds of issues. Now, what first brought her to national notoriety was her decision in the early 1970s to bring to an end a policy which had been in place ever since the 1940s, when every British school child was given a free bottle of milk to drink. Back in the 1940s, malnutrition was so widespread after the severe rationing of World War II that this was actually a very good idea, widely admired, by helping to redress the vitamin deficiency which a lot of British children suffered from. But by 1970, Britain was a much more prosperous nation. So the idea was we can save some money by no longer giving the milk to all children, but making it available to those who particularly need it. Well, a clever Labour minister at this point nicknamed her Margaret Thatcher, the Milk Snatcher. And I remember that the first time I ever heard her name was in this context when I was maybe 14. So from then on, she was vulnerable to nicknaming by opponents. The Edward Heath government also ran into a lot of difficulties from the passionate opposition of trade unions. Trade union leaders were in a position to call out their members on strike and to paralyze important parts of the economy. And I remember that the early 1970s was a period when always part of the British workforce was on strike. Power station workers went on strike for about 6 months, and we had only limited access to electricity. We'd have 6 or 12-hour blackouts. Car makers, coal miners, steel workers, dockyard workers, post office employees, one by one, all would go on strike, striking for higher pay. And in 1974, Heath tried to take them on in an election in which his slogan was, "Who runs the country?" Meaning, me, Edward Heath, or the unions. Well, the electorate's answer was, "Not you." And so to Heath's bitter disappointment, he lost the election of 1974. That brought back Harold Wilson. This was early in 74, and then in October of the same year, he held a second election to increase his parliamentary majority. In American politics, we have a regular cycle of elections, so that we know that every 4 years there will be a presidential election, every 2 years members of the House are up for re-election, and every 6 years members of the Senate. Britain has an arrangement in which every 5 years there must be a general election. But at any time short of that 5 years, the Prime Minister is entitled to dissolve Parliament and call one more quickly. So 1971 is one of several years when there have been 2 elections in the same year. Wilson resigned in 76 due to bad health, and James Callaghan took over and was Prime Minister from then until 1979. Now, in the Conservative Party, Edward Heath's defeat in 1974 led to his fall from the leadership of the Conservative Party. And in the intra-Conservative Party election challenge which followed, there were 2 main candidates. One was William Whitelaw, shown on the left, and the other was Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher was popular among the backbenchers, that is, the country MPs like herself, many of whom had come from relatively lowly origins. But to the surprise of most of the onlookers, she was the one who won the leadership. So at that point, she became the first woman ever to lead one of Britain's principal political parties. And it was a position in which she had to really feel her way, because she was still a relative outsider, even though by then she'd been a member of Parliament for 15 or 16 years and had been a minister. One of the first things she did was to visit America to meet the leaders with whom she'd have to work if she became Prime Minister. Her first visit to America had come back in 1967 when she was in her early 40s. And she loved it. She loved everything about it. She loved the energy, the dynamism, the entrepreneurial spirit, the optimism, and the fact that American businesses were great at getting things done and making a profit. And she described it as a wonderful breath of fresh air after the mood of stifling socialist decline, which was characteristic of British life. So here she's shown meeting with Gerald Ford. This must be before he lost the election of 76. And then a year or two later, meeting with Jimmy Carter. And because she was now the leader of the opposition in a big NATO ally, the members of the American political establishment put out the red carpet for her. And this helped her to establish her credentials. And from then right through to the end of her political career, she was absolutely fixed in her certainty that America was Britain's primary ally in the world. Britain, after World War II, it had to make some decisions about where its future lay. It had got a great empire, but the empire was rapidly breaking up, a process which was defended and was accelerated by Clement Attlee's Labour government. And although the British Commonwealth took over, the Commonwealth was a far less significant organisation than the empire had been. Britain could have thrown in its lot with a Europe which was gradually beginning to unify, first as the common market, then as the European Economic Union, and finally as the European Union, which it is today. Or it could throw in its lot with America. And of the three, Thatcher was convinced America is the most important because we're involved in a deadly struggle against the Soviet Union, and that's the most important thing. America heads NATO, and we've got to show that we're its absolutely dogged, loyal ally. She won the election of 1979 and became Britain's first conservative female leader. And she was really the third woman to rise to leadership of one of the great nations in the world. One was Indira Gandhi, and the other was Golda Meir in India and Israel, respectively. But again, there's an important difference that Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Nehru, the first prime minister of an independent India. And Golda Meir was a member of the old Zionist elite from the very highest ranks of Israeli political society. Whereas Margaret Thatcher really was self-made through hard work, determination, and ability. Now, most politicians who saw her giving speeches in Parliament said she wasn't a great parliamentarian. As you know, there have been politicians who were bewitching parliamentary orators, people like Gladstone and Disraeli and Winston Churchill, who gave spellbinding speeches and absolutely captivated the nation and wove an almost magical spell. Churchill's House of Commons speeches remain legendary right up to the present because they were so skillfully done. Thatcher wasn't like that. She was a little bit shrill, a little bit dogmatic. One of her nicknames was Attila the Hen, and this was often said of her when she was making speeches. On the other hand, she excelled at the twice weekly meetings of Parliament where the Prime Minister has to show up to answer questions delivered by members of the opposition. This is called Prime Minister's Question Time. Because she was so well informed, because she was always up at 5:30 in the morning, reading avidly, learning the details of what was going on, not just in foreign policy or big national issues, but the details of fisheries policy, the details of agricultural policy. Very often, the members of the opposition hoped to be able to embarrass her at Prime Minister's Question Time, but they could hardly ever do so because she knew so much detail. She was a fanatic for good preparation. So it quite often happened that she'd deliver back even more statistics than the shadow minister had been able to offer. And then she'd take great pleasure in beating them into the ground. Now, this was referred to by people who experienced it as a handbagging. In other words, the joke was that the lady prime minister is beating them with her handbag. She always carried one of these handbags, which became fashion watchers used to look out for them. And so it was obviously it's a sexist joke at the expense of the prime minister. Now, one of the great problems she faced as prime minister coming into office in 1979, the same year as the second oil crisis, was that she had to encounter this horrible mixture of stagnation and inflation, stagflation, which afflicted most of the Western economies. And she had to endure rising levels of unemployment. It was clear by then that Britain simply couldn't compete on the world market. And one by one, British industries were either going out of business altogether or were running at a loss. Now, one of the consequences of having a nationalized economy is that it can run at a loss because it can be subsidized by the state. Fear of unemployment had led governments from both parties to say, it's true that Britain's coal mining industry, for example, can no longer profit. But on the other hand, if we close down the mines, thousands of men will be thrown out of work in towns where there's no alternative. And that was such an unpalatable idea that the nationalized industries kept going, often running at a loss. Thatcher was determined to bring that to an end. Her view was, we may have a short-term unemployment crisis, but then it'll give us the opportunity to jumpstart a more dynamic private economy, which can revive Britain's competitive place in the world. And that's what we've got to do. So although she understood that unemployment is politically dangerous and it's wretched and it imposes suffering on people, she said it's not the worst of all evils. The worst evil is national decline. So here are the unemployment figures, which show that from the moment she came into office in 1979, it rose very steeply from about 6% when she started to above 12% in the worst year of 1982. Her predecessors as prime ministers wouldn't have been able to endure that. They'd have backed away from such a confrontational approach to economic issues. Now, one piece of economic good news for Margaret Thatcher and for Britain in general was that by then, North Sea oil was coming online. The two oil crises of the 1970s, 1973 and then 79, which led to a sharp rise in oil prices, were the years in which OPEC became very prominent, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And it showed that places like Britain were too dependent on politically volatile places in the Middle East, and that Britain was vulnerable to disruption, especially if it sympathized with Israel, because OPEC would retaliate against Israel's allies. Well, the discovery of oil in the North Sea had led to its exploration. They're very inhospitable waters in which to work, because it means that the oil industry now had to not simply sink the wells, it had to do it on the seabed by building these platforms and then by finding ways to cope with the terrible climate, and then to build underwater pipelines which brought oil and natural gas ashore to terminals in Scotland and northern England. But as the North Sea oil and gas came online, it made Britain less dependent on imports from abroad, and it made Britain a net exporter of oil and gasoline, obviously central commodities in the industrial economy. And that helped Britain's economic recovery. One of Margaret Thatcher's best political friends was Ronald Reagan. He won the American election of 1980 and was inaugurated in early 81, by which time she'd already been prime minister for about a year and a half. So briefly, she was the senior of the two in terms of experience. But throughout, in fact, the whole time that Reagan was president, she was British prime minister, and he got on very well with her and she with him. They were very different temperamentally because he was sunny and relaxed and wasn't particularly interested in detail, whereas she was a great workaholic who wanted to know the details about everything. But on the big questions, they thought with one mind. She thoroughly approved of the speech in which he described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. She said the most important issue we face is the Soviet Union and the Cold War. We've got to bring it to an end. And they both were great believers in industrial capitalism. Now, you may remember that when Michael Dukakis rode in a tank in the election of 1988, he made himself look ridiculous and lost the election. I think Margaret Thatcher looks ridiculous in this tank. The goggles are far too big for her, but somehow she got away with it in a way that Dukakis didn't. And it was in 1982 that she had the opportunity to lead Britain into a war which had almost magical effects at reviving British nationalist pride and, in fact, xenophobic pride, love of the country and its military successes and hatred of its enemies. And the war was fought against Argentina. This is Leopoldo Galtieri, an Argentinian general who became the dictator during one of the most disgraceful episodes of Argentina's history, horrible violations of human rights on a massive scale. It was a disgraceful regime. It was so unpopular in 1982 that the dictator hoped he might be able to revive the popularity of his regime by invading the Falkland Islands, which are shown at the bottom right of the picture there, a tiny cluster of islands off the eastern coast of Argentina. They'd been settled by Britain more than 100 years previously, when Britain had a world-spanning empire. And they were used as a coaling station for British steamships as they went around the world in Britain's great imperial days. The small population were mainly sheep farmers, and they associated with England. Now, Galtieri gambled that taking this move would be popular with the Argentinian people. They would revive his popularity. And that the British, now that they were no longer a major imperial power, would accept some kind of mediation, perhaps by the United Nations, perhaps by the Organization of American States. But he'd misjudged Margaret Thatcher. She said, under no circumstances will we accept this act of unprovoked aggression from Argentina. And so she ordered her generals to gather together what was left of Britain's fleet and all its military forces and sent them off on a great expeditionary force south towards the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, another tiny island which the Argentinians also took over. And it took a long time to get there. And so all the way, commentators around the world were saying, well, surely this is just a bluff. There's not really going to be a war, is there? But the answer is that there really was a war in which both sides lost several hundred men. A British warship called the HMS Sheffield was hit directly by an Argentinian missile, and you can see the dramatic picture of it here blowing up. Conversely, a British submarine sank the Argentinian warship, the General Belgrano, which sank. Here's a notorious headline from the British newspaper, The Sun. It's a tabloid paper which retails sort of a conservative slant on the news. And this headline, "Gotcha, our lads sink gunboat," was taken to be a horrible way of reflecting on an event which cost about 380 Argentinian lives. British liberal opinion was that the war was unnecessary and that it should have been mediated, and that it was disgraceful to gloat over the killing of enemy combatants. So Britain itself was highly divided. Britain's intellectuals, on the whole, were against the war, but the mass of popular opinion was strongly in favor of it. Vital to the success of Britain's war effort was the opinion of the Americans. And the American cabinet was split. Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense, was wholeheartedly in favor of the British point of view. He also said, we have to stop aggressors wherever they appear. We're NATO allies with Britain. Our Navy and our Army and our Air Force work together constantly. America's got air bases in Britain. Of course, we should do everything we can to help Britain. On the other hand, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was the United States ambassador to the United Nations, said, we're an American state. Argentina is an American state. We're members of the Organization of American States. We ought not to permit this kind of divisiveness within the Americas. And this is a distraction from the Cold War. We ought to make sure that Britain isn't permitted to undertake a military adventure of this kind. Well, President Reagan sided with Margaret Thatcher. He was grateful to her for her unstinting support for NATO policy. So American ships came out to refuel the British flotilla. American satellites sent advice to the British military and helped ensure a British victory. As soon as the islands had been resecured, Margaret Thatcher flew out to the islands and toured them and had herself photographed among the troops. The Falkland Islands are very windy, and you can see here she's a little bit uncharacteristically windswept by the circumstances in the Falklands. Here's a funny poster from the early 80s. This was the period when there was a large anti-nuclear movement, particularly in Britain, but really across the world, deploring Reagan's refusal to sign the SALT II treaty and his determination to launch a new generation of missiles, the MX missiles, the Pershing IIs, and to update America's nuclear preparedness. So it's a parody, obviously, of the Gone with the Wind poster, which shows Cary Grant and Vivian Leigh in Gone with the Wind. But here it is, Gone with the Wind, the most explosive love story ever. She promised to follow him to the end of the earth. He promised to organize it. So this is a poster from the anti-nuclear campaign. A long-running demonstration took place at Greenham Common in England, which is a US Air Force base in the English Midlands. And a group of British feminists surrounded the camp. It became the Great Women's Peace Camp. The claim was that women have got a special affinity for peace and nurture. So it's a famous moment in British feminism. But it was no more than symbolic, first because it was absolutely peaceful, and second because the new nuclear missiles which were delivered to Greenham Common came by air, which was nothing the feminists could do to stop. Thatcher herself, incidentally, never had much sympathy with feminism, even though in some respects she embodied the feminist aspiration to important careers and to leadership. She herself took the view politics is a men's game, and a woman who wants to play politics has got to play it by the men's rules, which she did. And in fact, she, if anything, overdid it. Now, the popularity which she garnered among the electorate for the Falklands War led her to call a second election in 1983, earlier than she had to because of the 5-year rule, but she was confident that she would win. The Labour Party was now led by Michael Foot. Personally, I think Michael Foot's a wonderful person. He was a great historian. In other words, his job was the same as mine, professional historian. But there's no doubt that he was a terrible party leader for Labour. He constantly misjudged the public mood. And his party was soundly defeated in the election of 1983, partly because one of its platforms was unilateral nuclear disarmament. Michael Foot said, because we're a civilized nation, we're not going to defend ourselves with the threat of mass annihilation with nuclear weapons. Well, this turned out to be an unpopular view because of fear of the Soviet Union. And so one of the Conservative MPs described the Labour manifesto as the longest suicide note in history. The map on the right shows the election of 1983. Blue means Conservative victories. You can see that they're very dominant, especially in rural England. Yellow is an alliance between the Social Democratic Party and the Liberals. And red is Labour victories, which are geographically concentrated in the most industrial areas. South Wales, coal mining and steel. Lancashire and Yorkshire, coal mining, textiles, iron and steel, metalwork. The northeast of England, and the lowlands of Scotland, Glasgow and Edinburgh. One of the policies of the Conservative government in the 80s was to sell council houses. Council houses had been built between the 1920s and the 1970s, the equivalent of public housing. It was basic and it was decent, but it was drab and grey, as you can see from the lower photograph. Now, Thatcher had the idea, if we let the tenants of council houses buy their houses, that means that they will become property owners, and property owners are more likely to vote Conservative. So she and her ministers sold off the council houses, and the longer the tenant had lived in it, the lower the price he or she would have to pay. And straight away, that meant that they became individualistic. They could be extended, they could be painted white, little porches and bow windows could be added. So the top picture shows a council house as modified by its proud owner. It was in her second administration also that Margaret Thatcher really came to grips with trade union power. 2 pieces of legislation went through the Houses of Parliament to restrict the power of trade unions. First of all, to outlaw secondary strikes, so that if, for example, the steel workers were on strike, the coal miners couldn't go out of work in sympathetic strike with the steel workers. And second, said, from now on, individual union members will vote in issues affecting the union as a whole, rather than have their union leaders dictate to them. Because union leaders, especially the leaders of big unions, have become extremely autocratic figures in their own right, especially in matters affecting the Labour Party, because the Labour Party had been founded by the unions and had an outsized say in Labour Party conduct. The most devastating of all the strikes of the mid-1980s was the coal miners' strike. Coal mining was a big industry in Britain and had been ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The National Union of Mine Workers was led by Arthur Scargill, a man of very, very left-wing views. He was known in Britain as a Trotskyist. Here in the picture on the left, you can see him second from the left wearing the red tie. He called out the coal miners' union, believing that If there's no coal, a lot of people will lose heat and they'll lose electricity because the power stations are mainly fueled by coal. Thatcher responded, we are not going to negotiate. We're going to force you back to work and we're going to break the power of your union. Well, after more than a year, and extreme bitterness and a lot of fighting around picket lines, a period of intense polarization of public opinion, the miners lost and were forced back to work. Here's a graph showing coal production in Britain, and it shows you that there was a long-time decline in British coal mining, which accelerated during the Thatcher years because she was determined not to keep open mines which couldn't make a profit. And by now, the mining has almost completely disappeared in British life. So she accelerated a long-term secular trend which was taking place in any case. Every year, the Conservative Party held a conference, usually at a seaside resort. And in 1984, the party was meeting in Brighton, a seaside town on the south coast, when it was bombed by the Provisional IRA, the Irish Republican Army. The IRA had been using violent tactics ever since 1969. This was part of the long-running troubles which Britain had, particularly with Northern Ireland. It happened in the middle of the night. One MP was killed, several other people were killed, and many were hurt as part of the building collapsed. But another of Margaret Thatcher's great publicity coups was the ability to appear, even though it was in the middle of the night. A few minutes later, she appeared with her hair well turned out, well dressed, apparently unflustered, saying, "This attack has failed. All attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail." So she won a great public relations victory from her sang-froid and her calm demeanor at the time of the Brighton attack. But by 1985-86, she was becoming more and more high-handed inside her own party. She was increasingly reluctant to take advice from other ministers, with the result that one by one, the original fellow leaders of the Conservative Party had started to resign, many because they found her so intolerant of dissent. Cabinet meetings became shorter and shorter because she wasn't interested in discussing policy. She made up her mind what policy she wanted, and the cabinet simply met briefly once a week to be told, this is the policy we are going to enact. And ministers who felt that they couldn't go along with her started to resign. There was a crisis in 85-6 when Michael Heseltine, one of her most senior ministers, the Minister of Defence, resigned. A British helicopter manufacturer called Westland was going into bankruptcy, and it was looking for someone to buy it. Now, Margaret Thatcher favoured Sikorsky, the American manufacturer, but Heseltine made an arrangement with a European consortium to buy Westland. But having done so, and having believed that the transaction was complete, he was then publicly overruled by Margaret Thatcher, who arranged for Westland to go to Sikorsky after all. He felt humiliated. There were various bits of political skullduggery involved in the sale to Sikorsky, and this led to a public inquiry, which was led by Margaret Thatcher loyalists who were suspected of covering up some political irregularities. So Heseltine went into opposition within the Conservative Party, and this was really one of the events which was the beginning of the end for her dominance of the party. But certainly in the short run, she seemed unchallenged. Margaret Thatcher won for the third time in the election of 1987, this time defeating another Labour leader, Neil Kinnock. In 1984, she'd also met Gorbachev before he became leader of the Soviet Union. And it was clear to Thatcher that he was a very different kind of leader than Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernyenko had been. And she said to Reagan, Gorbachev is someone with whom potentially we can have dealings. And this turned out to be prophetic because, of course, very much to everyone's surprise, he was the man who presided over the end of the Cold War without it coming to a nuclear exchange. One question of obvious interest at the time and since was whether Margaret Thatcher got along with the Queen. They were born the same year, 1925, so they were exact contemporaries. And outwardly, they maintained a show of mutual respect and mutual admiration, although actually neither liked the other. Thatcher went to visit the Queen every week. The Queen found her views intolerable or difficult to bear, and she found Margaret Thatcher terribly inflexible. But when they were in public, as in this meeting with President Reagan, they were always careful to maintain a show of unanimity. And Thatcher certainly respected the monarchy as an emblem of Britain's national unity. Upstaging both of them in the 80s, of course, was Princess Diana, whose marriage to Prince Charles had taken place in 1982. So Thatcher, the Queen, and Princess Diana were the three most prominent British women in the 1980s. And there was lots of tension among all of them. The beginning of the end for Thatcher as Prime Minister came in 1990 when Geoffrey Howe resigned. He was the only one of her original ministers from 1979 who'd been continuously in her presence throughout the 12 years of her leadership. But in 1990, he resigned when she undermined his position over the question of the European Monetary Union, the EMU. He was strongly in favour of it. He thought he'd negotiated this for Britain, only to be overridden in public by Thatcher, which led to his resignation in disgrace. At that point, she was challenged for leadership inside her own party, something which can happen to any time to a party leader. And her two prominent rivals were Michael Heseltine, whom you can see on the left in this picture, and John Major, whom you can see on the right. Well, in the first ballot, Margaret Thatcher did win the most votes, but she didn't win an overall majority, which meant that she would then have to face a runoff election. And rather than do so, she accepted the advice of her senior advisors that by now she was so unpopular in the nation as a whole for her autocratic ways that she'd be likely to lead the Conservative Party to defeat rather than victory when the next election came along. So at that point, she did resign, handing over not to Heseltine, who'd hoped to be able to win, but to John Major, who became her successor. Here she is speaking outside number 10 Downing Street for the last time, and they're typical newspaper posters. Maggie quits as MP. That was her official, or not official, but her most common nickname. So she was succeeded by John Major, a British Prime Minister of the late 20th century who hadn't got a college degree. And he won the next election of 1992, so that the Conservatives were in office uninterrupted from 79 right through to 97, 18 years, when finally Labour Party leader Tony Blair was able to win an election. It was in 92, under Major's leadership, that Britain finally signed the Maastricht Treaty, bringing into being the European Union, a much closer union between the various political members of Europe. Thatcher's comment was, "I would never have signed that treaty." She wrote her memoirs. She went to a seat in the House of Lords after 1992, and she had the honour of being given a bronze statue in the House of Commons. They often appear, but usually after the person's death. Hers appeared before she died, and her comment was at the opening of the statue, "I might have preferred iron, but bronze will do. It won't rust." In subsequent years, she was honoured in many parts of the world, particularly in Spain, where a plaza in Madrid was renamed the Plaza Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher died in 2013, and she was divisive right to the end. The Daily Mail, a Conservative paper, said, "The woman who saved Britain," and that's certainly the Conservative view. The Daily Mirror, a Labour party, says, a Labour paper says, "The woman who divided a nation." And The Guardian from the left says, "She became harder than hard." There were areas of Britain, particularly Brixton in South London, where enormous demonstrations took place, celebrating the fact that she died, with demonstrators holding posters that said, "The bitch is dead." So right to the end of her life, she stirred very strong feelings. But there's no question that Margaret Thatcher was a very, very important person and a vitally important leader whose administration in the 1980s marks the great dividing line in Britain's post-World War II political history. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions. Let me turn straight away to the questions now. I'm reading from the chat. The first question is this. I have two friends in Liverpool, England, who are lifelong Labour Party members. They have told me that Thatcher's economic policies ravaged the industrial areas and cities of northern England and only benefited the Tory areas around London. My friends think Thatcher's policies did great harm to British manufacturing, and the negative effects can still be felt to this day. What is your response to these criticisms? Well, I would say that in part they're justified. It's true that areas which were coal mining areas, steel making, shipbuilding, the classic old industries of the Industrial Revolution were very severely hurt. But that was because Britain could no longer compete with the Netherlands or Taiwan or China in making these kinds of things competitively. For a long time, they were kept alive on the life support system of nationalized industries, but Thatcher was determined to do away with those things. So it's true that today the economic fortunes of different parts of Britain are very different. The most prosperous area is in the southeast of Britain, but also in the Midlands, the area around Birmingham. And it's true that some of the old industrial towns in Yorkshire and Lancashire have been severely harmed. There's a massive disparity of housing costs, for example, between those depressed industrial towns and London, where property is very expensive. If you saw the movie The Full Monty, which was set in Sheffield, one of the old manufacturing towns, that gives a brilliant impression of life in a community of mass unemployment, which seems to stretch forward into the indefinite future. One of the differences between Britain and America is that Americans have got a long tradition of moving whenever necessary to work somewhere else. And by contrast, in Britain, there's a very strong tradition of staying where you were born for your entire life. So that people who live in communities which are suffering from high unemployment don't do the same thing that their American counterparts would do and go elsewhere. And the British welfare state is dense enough that people can continue to live on government supplied benefits, whereas in America, eventually they'd run out and they'd have to move. Another question is this: can you compare the Conservative Party to conservatism in the United States? What does it mean in the two countries? Well, there are similarities. In both cases, conservatives are the party who support free enterprise capitalism, which itself is a paradox because probably nothing's done more to transform the world in the last 200 years than capitalism, because it's a system that's based on innovation. But it came to be thought of as conservative because it's less radical than socialism or communism. But there are some striking differences. In Britain, it also includes the idea of noblesse oblige. That is, people of higher social class have special responsibilities and duties to those lower down the social scale. Britain's a very class stratified society, or at least it was in the mid and late 20th centuries. So there's less expectation of social equality and more expectation that everybody's got a place on the ladder, and they look both up and down to the people above and below them and have a sense of responsibilities and duties towards people in different positions. To be a British conservative would be to be totally opposed to gun ownership, for example. So there are ways in which the two are very different, but that hasn't as much to do with national tradition as it does with the meaning of the word itself. But in both cases, conservatism embodies the idea that the best fund of wisdom we've got for thinking about the future is the accumulated experience of the past, and that it's usually a bad idea to set off in radically new directions. Another question is, do I understand that politicians can pick their territory? Not really, no, because in each case, the party, if you, for example, if you want to be a member of parliament, as Margaret Thatcher did, she goes to the central party and says that she'd like to stand for a parliamentary seat. And usually when the person's a newcomer, as she was in 1950, she's given the task of opposing an incumbent whose party is dominant. So she was sent first to Dartford, with which she'd got no prior traditions, to see how she could get on running against a Labour Party incumbent. And she did well enough to erode his majority, but not enough to overthrow it. Then the party organisers began to conclude she'll be a real asset to our party. So then when the Conservative Member of Parliament for Finchley said he was going to retire, they said, let's make Margaret Thatcher the candidate for Finchley. So, and they did, and she won there. I mean, one of the obvious differences is that the constituencies are much smaller in Britain than they are in America because it's a smaller country. So in America, you'd be at a fairly severe disadvantage if you were running from the state in which you had no, you hadn't grown up. Although it can happen, obviously. Hillary Clinton ran for Senate from New York, even though she'd grown up in Illinois. But you're certainly not free simply to say, I'll choose this constituency. The next question is this. What is your historical view of Thatcher's involvement in the cover-up of the Hillsborough Stadium disaster in which 97 people were killed? I'm not sure that cover-up is the right word. It was a terrible disaster at a soccer stadium when, in those days, it was quite common for most of the fans to arrive at the stadium and stand to watch the game. I used to do it throughout my childhood when I went to see my local team, Derby County. And when the stadium was packed, there'd be great surging masses around the stands. So it would sometimes cause you to have to rush up and down the stadium as people got overexcited. Anyway, at Hillsborough, there was a terrible disaster when nearly 100 people, I think, died by being crushed in one of these surges. The government report which followed said, from now on, we ought to insist that everybody sits in the stadium rather than stands. And that's what's happened. So now if you go to a Premier or Championship League game, you have a seat. That means that the capacity of the stadiums has gone down. But it's also true that to go there now, the price has gone up a lot. When I go back to Britain now, I'm shocked at how much it costs to go and see my old favourite team. Next question is, could you please summarise the role of a shadow minister? Yes, I mentioned this briefly, but it doesn't have really an American counterpart. Here's the first thing to say. When an election takes place in Britain, the person who's lost leaves 10 Downing Street that day, and the new Prime Minister comes in that day. And because there isn't a regular schedule of elections, but they can happen at short notice, each party has got to be ready to take over. So that, for example, when the Conservative Party was in the opposition during the late 1960s, Margaret Thatcher was given the job of Shadow Minister of Education. Now, what that meant was that if the Conservatives won an election, they would at once be in power, and they'd at once have to pick up the work of all the different departments. So her job in those days was to follow very closely what was happening in the Department of Education, and usually the Labour Minister of Education, as a courtesy, would let her know what was going on, so that in the event of a change of government, there could be continuity in the department itself. If you've ever seen the British TV show Yes, Minister, it's really a satire on British politics because it makes the point that the permanent staff, the civil servants of the various departments, actually do most of the running. And although members of the different parties come and go as ministers, it's really the civil servants who do it. But the idea of the shadow minister is that at all times, members of the opposition party are ready to step in when their moment comes. The next question is this. What kind of mother was Thatcher? It seems that she may have been an absentee parent. Well, I think that's right. She can't possibly have been a closely attentive mother to her twins when they were growing up. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, when they were young, the vast majority of British middle-class women stayed at home as housewives. Whereas from the time they were about 5, she was a member of Parliament with a very, very demanding schedule indeed. Her son, Mark, in fact, grew up to be really the antithesis of what she had been like as a child. They didn't keep up the strict Methodist adherence. The family became Church of England, and I don't think the children kept going to church. And he later on took advantage of his mother's position to be a kind of go-between among various business people. So he was he didn't have the same kind of flinty self-discipline that she had had in her early life. The daughter, Carol, actually wrote a book, a biography of her father, which is full of insight into what it must be like to be Margaret Thatcher's daughter and to live in that hothouse of a family. So I recommend it to you very strongly. It's good fun. Now, another question asks this, or says this, Overall, Thatcher has a negative impression, or gives a negative impression. How much of this was misogyny? Well, I think the answer is not much, really. There's certainly plenty of sexism in British life. I mean, there still is now, and there certainly was then. And as I mentioned, Margaret Thatcher was completely uninterested in feminism. She didn't want to rewrite the rules. She simply wanted to take advantage of the situation as it was and find ways to get some leverage out of being a woman, which on the face of it was a disadvantage. She was looking for ways to turn it to an advantage. And she was often accused of being a school mom or a nanny or a nurse or a scolding housewife. But sometimes she would say on TV appearances, now I'm speaking to the women of Britain who understand, as I do, how important it is to oppose inflation. So she'd sometimes take on these roles, knowing that she'd be parodied for it in any case, so she'd make the most of it. And there were moments when she was very successful at doing exactly that. I think British feminists would have liked to admire her, but in fact, they found her an absolutely uncompromising figure. And because feminists tend to be on the political left, whereas she was on the hard political right, there was never much love lost between those two groups. Next question is this. Thatcher embraced Gorbachev as someone she could do business with. Did she ever encounter Putin? What would she have thought of him and how would she have dealt with him? Well, I think she would have regarded Putin as very much more like the other Soviet leaders, Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernyenko. Because Gorbachev was genuinely interested in transforming the Soviet Union, he recognized that it was an absolute basket case by the mid-80s. He was much younger than the other Politburo members. When he visited her, he spoke frankly. Similarly, when he met Reagan, they made friends very quickly. And you probably remember there was that intoxicating moment at Reykjavik in Iceland, I think it was 86, where they came within a whisker of saying, let's abolish nuclear weapons altogether, much to the horror of the State Department and the Defense Department. So I think Thatcher and Reagan both recognized in Gorbachev that there was genuinely something new about him. Obviously, the tragic, miserable experience of Putin is that bit by bit, he's snuffed out Russian democracy. He's become an autocrat, almost in the tradition of the czars and obviously he's not nowhere remotely as bad as Stalin. He hasn't yet undertaken a policy of mass extermination of his own people. But there's a grim, horrible familiarity to Putin. Gorbachev was totally different. I don't suppose that Thatcher ever came across him because by the time he really came to power in Russia in 2000, she was already spending her last days in the House of Lords and was close to retiring. And I think by then was suffering from the onset of Alzheimer's disease. The next question is this. Although characters make the occasional negative comment in both the film and the stage production of Billy Elliot, there is a musical number that truly represents the general dislike, vulgar dislike of her by the working class. Did Thatcher ever see the film or the stage production? And if so, what was her reaction? Well, I'm sorry to say I don't know enough about her. I mean, the absolute minute details of her life to be able to say if she ever saw the show. I think it's unlikely because probably some of her advisors would have warned her that it was going to be uncomfortable viewing for her. And but what you say is absolutely right. Among working class, and particularly Labour working class people, she was hated and despised, really with an almost unparalleled intensity. And what's so striking about her is that she was willing to be hated. Normally, politicians have a great thirst to be loved by the electorate, but she didn't care about that. I mean, she really was an ideologue in the sense that she said, there are certain things we've got to do to put Britain back on the right path. And no matter what it takes, I'm going to do it or die trying. And if people hate me for it, so much the worse. I remember very vividly, I was back in England in, I think it was 1987, an election year. And by then I'd already been living in America almost full time since 1978. And I was with my father and my brother And they were both saying how much they disliked Thatcher, but nevertheless, they were going to vote for her. And I should add, by the way, that although working class people are more likely to vote Labour, not all of them do so. And there's always been a big working class Conservative constituency. One of my grandfathers was like that. He always voted Conservative because he said the Conservatives understand the important issues confronting the nation better than the Labour Party does, even though he himself was a factory worker. Next question is this. Are there similarities to the Falklands War with what is going on with Ukraine? No, I don't think there are similarities. I think that the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands was a cynical act by a dictator who was afraid he was going to be overthrown at home because he was so bitterly unpopular. Putin's position in Russia is nowhere near as desperate as that of Galtieri was in Argentina. If you were looking for similarities, I suppose you could say that Argentina claimed that the Falkland Islands ought to belong to them. And similarly, Putin claims that the Ukraine ought to belong to Russia. Throughout much of its history, Ukraine has been part of the Tsarist Empire and then of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But as soon as you get into the details, you're much more struck by the differences than by the similarities. Next question is this. Are the surviving industries that Thatcher privatized investing in the future and in the country, or are the executives just keeping all the profits? Well, some of each. Income disparities have increased in Britain just as they've increased here in the United States. On the other hand, everybody is getting richer. Britain's a much, much more prosperous nation now than it was in 1979 when she became Prime Minister, or than it was in 1990 when she left office. So there's been a rising tide in Britain, which has raised all boats. The makeup of the British economy has changed. It's true, as I mentioned to one of the earlier questioners, that there's now far less heavy industrial manufacturing going in Britain. That's nearly all gone offshore to mainly to third world countries, although quite a lot goes on in the Netherlands. But Britain's service industries have gone forward by leaps and bounds, and Britain's reasserted its place as one of the great hubs of the international financial world. The really interesting question that's confronted Britain recently has been the surprising outcome of the 2016 vote, when Britain narrowly voted to leave the European Union, Brexit. Britain was an integral member of the European Union from 92 until 2016. And I think that everybody was surprised that the vote in the Brexit election was to leave. People who opposed Brexit, and if I'd been there, I would have voted against leaving the European Union, are afraid that Britain's going to be marginalized economically because of having left. Although I must admit that there's not very much sign of that happening so far. So the ghastly predictions that were made of Britain becoming insignificant in the world economy certainly haven't come to fruit so far. And obviously, let's hope that they never do. I think the greatest hopes of the Brexiteers haven't been realised, and the worst fears of the anti-Brexiteers have also not yet been recognised. Next question is this. Well, in fact, looking ahead, I see that somebody's asked, what would Margaret Thatcher have thought about Brexit? And the answer is that she would have been in favour of it. She was willing to enter a slightly united Europe. In other words, she understood the benefits of having a huge free trade area, so that goods could flow freely between all the member nations without being interrupted by tariffs. And ever since Adam Smith, that's usually been regarded as a very good idea to expand the size of the market and have things being traded freely. But she was much more of a little Englander in the sense that she didn't want foreigners becoming involved in British policy questions. And she shrank from the idea that Germans or Italians or Spaniards should have the chance to make decisions which would affect ordinary life inside Britain. I showed in one of the slides that she'd been opposed to the Maastricht Treaty, which created the European Union. And she was fully in support of Britain not becoming part of the euro currency zone. So from the time the euro came in about 2001, Britain was a member of the European Union, but still had its separate currency. So there's always a tension there. And she was very much on the side of those who wanted the wanted to keep some distance. Next question is this. Can you please expand on Thatcher's impact on the Troubles? I know she took a hard view with respect to IRA violence, but to what extent was she responsible for the ultimate peace in Northern Ireland? I think the answer there is really not much. Her view was that so long as a majority of the people who lived in Ulster, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, voted to stay as part of Great Britain, she was going to make sure that they would do so. And she was implacably uncompromising. So whereas eventually the Good Friday arrangement that was made at the very end of the 20th century was based upon a lot of mutual give and take and concessions, she would have been reluctant to make concessions of that kind. She was uncompromising there, just as she had been with the Falklands. I'm sorry to say it's now 10 after 5 and it's time for me to wind up. But thanks so much for coming along to listen. And I look forward to seeing you again before too long. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.